Lion, and of course to the Grateful Dead house at 710 Ashbury. And to think that 50 or so years ago, around the time of the Summer of Love, it was a different bus that rode up the street. A gray line tour bus loaded with middle-aged passengers gawking at the flower children. The driver would read from a script, "Welcome to the hippie hop, a safari through Psychedelphia. As I said, you are on the only foreign tour within the boundaries of the United States of America." That's the way it was. Right, Harry Reasoner? One of the more famous of the 100,000 people who were said to have come here to the Haight was George Harrison. This was in August 1967, the Summer of Love. Fans and reporters followed him up Haight Street, past Nasidica and Peggy Caserta, onto Hippie Hill, and someone asked him what he thought, and he was quoted, "Wow, if it's all like this, it's all too much." But years later, he changed his mind and his tune. "I expected them to be nice and clean and happy," he said. Instead, he found the hippies hideous, spotty little teenagers. As I wrote for one magazine in 2007, it was like that for the Haight. One minute, a funky oasis bathed in a psychedelic glow. The next, a battered testament to human frailties and excess. Soon after the Summer of Love, the neighborhood would be ravaged by drugs and violence. And then in the mid-70s, it would be yappified as baby boomers moved in and fixed up dilapidated homes. Boutiques and bookstores arrived, and so did a Ben & Jerry's, offering cherry Garcia ice cream. Well, Ben & Jerry's is still here, just downstairs, across the street. Deadheads still considered a shrine of sorts. That's where many of them gathered when Jerry died in 1995. Hippies are still here, or their children and grandchildren. Grandchildren of the 60s, generation of hipsters. Tourists still flock to look around, to pick up memorabilia, and to hear stories about what happened here, and why, and what it all meant. That's one reason that the news you will hear now about this landmark building is so welcome. From SF Heritage, please welcome the Executive Director, Mike Buehler.
Thanks so much, Ben, for being here today as a survivor, and many other survivors in the room today. Welcome to the Doolan-Larson Building at the crossroads of the counterculture. As we gather here to celebrate the legacy of the 1960s, it must be noted, as Ben alluded to earlier, that this chapter in American history once elicited widespread scorn and contempt. Indeed, as Harry Reasoner stated in the 1967 CBS News special, The Hippie Temptation, the hippies object to the ills which beset society: war, social hatreds, money-grubbing, spiritual waste, but their remedy is to withdraw into private satisfactions. When one thinks of the problems of our day, which cry for action and imagination and youthful energy, this seems like the greatest waste of all. So here we are, more than 50 years later, and the far-reaching impacts of the counterculture movement are undeniable and profound. There's no doubt that our world has improved in myriad ways that can be traced back to the summer of '67, the Summer of Love. Thousands of people visit the Haight each year, but there is currently nowhere for them to learn about neighborhood history, the counterculture movement, and the continuing resonance of the movement today. There is no cultural destination. Today's announcement seeks to elevate and enshrine this corner as an important place in American history. We would not be here today but for the generosity and foresight of Norm Larson. Norm left this property to San Francisco Heritage last year upon his passing. A fourth generation San Franciscan, Norm cared deeply about this city, its history, and preserving it for future generations. Norm purchased his first building in the neighborhood in 1973, just a few years after the Summer of Love. But he was no hippie. Although his flowing white beard, he was often mistaken as a hippie, and he really kind of reveled in that fact and stopped correcting people later on. Norm moved into this building in 1985, compelled to restore it to its original configuration and its original grandeur. He slowly removed the walls, the partitions that had divided the space into 9 different rented rooms, and meticulously preserved it, hands-on by himself oftentimes. To this day, the Doolan-Larson Building is the only designated San Francisco City landmark that is specifically designated for its association with the counterculture era. Besides its famous address, the Doolan-Larson Building's primary association with the counterculture movement was Nasitica, which opened downstairs in 1966 as Haight Street's first hippie clothing boutique. Nasitica and its owner, Peggy Caserta, is here today. Peggy. Embodied many of the core values that would come to define the era. Self-empowerment, art, music, fashion. Its name, an obscure literary reference to the first known lesbians in history, was itself a declaration of sexual freedom. Caserta ultimately convinced Levi Strauss to widen the bottom of their famous blue jeans, creating the bell-bottoms trend. Nasitica's original storefront at 1510 Haight Street in this building remains largely intact today, and Peggy generously has lent us the original sign of Nasitica, which can be seen in the dining room parlor. We're so honored to have Peggy here today, and we're also honored to have Norm Larson's brother, Grant Larson, here today with us. Thank you, Grant, for being here. In an extraordinary gift to the people of San Francisco and the world, Norm entrusted us with this landmark to interpret the rich history of the counterculture era for others to understand and experience for years to come. It is truly an awesome responsibility. To help realize this vision, Heritage is working alongside a stellar team that includes the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Haight Street Art Center. To tell us more about that effort in the months ahead, I'd like to introduce Barb Paul, Vice President of the National Trust.
Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. Thank you all for being here, and I'm excited to be here for today's announcement. I want to begin by recognizing our amazing friends and partners at San Francisco Heritage. Mike is an alum of the National Trust, as is Courtney Damgarter, who's out there somewhere as well. We're proud to work with him and his team on what was our first treasure campaign in San Francisco, which was the Hacienda House. So this becomes our second. And thank you so much to Supervisor Brown for being with us today, and Ben Fong-Torres. Wow, we're so proud to have one of the main bylines of the air here with us today to celebrate and kick off this wonderful event. And special thanks to Peter McQuaid, who you hear from following me, and everyone in the Haight Street Art Center for being part of this project. I'm here today because the National Trust believes this building at this iconic corner of Haight-Ashbury is an important part of our nation's history, and we're deeply interested in its future. Because today, as you've already heard, we're standing at the cornerstone and the crossroads of America's counterculture. A half-century ago, a local theater troupe known as the Diggers helped launch a cultural revolution right here in Haight-Ashbury. Their vision of a kinder, freer, more idealistic, and experimental way of life inspired hundreds of thousands of young people across the country, many of whom flocked to this neighborhood in the 1960s. During the Summer of Love, 100,000 young people converged on this corner, and I was one of them.
Wow.
I was in San Francisco with my family to pick up my older brother, who'd been in Idaho at the Boy Scout World Jamboree. No hippies there. My father insisted that we come here to see what was going on. My mother was horrified, but my brother and I loved it, although we probably really didn't totally understand what it all meant. I thought the 60s were about long hair and bell-bottoms, embroidered tops from India, patchouli oil, and of course rock and roll. But it was more than that. The counterculture that arose right here at this corner changed our nation's frame of reference. It transformed our way of thinking about everything: art, fashion, music, sex, drugs, sure. But it was also about challenging the traditional roles of authority and speaking out in protest over the Vietnam War. The cultural revolution that began in the Haight 55 years ago still resonates throughout every facet of American life today. Social justice and activism, experimentation, broader tolerance for alternative lifestyles, concern for the environment, all came about because of what happened in the 1960s through this movement. And you can feel it today in our fights for drug decriminalization, more sexual equality, LGBT rights, equal access to health care and housing. Simply put, you cannot tell the story of modern America without talking about what happened right here at this corner. And that's why I'm proud today to officially announce that the corner of Haight-Ashbury is the National Trust's newest national treasure. National treasures are a revolving portfolio portfolio of diverse, historic, and critically important places across our country. And Haight-Ashbury is our 100th national treasure to be part of this portfolio. Among our treasures are historic buildings and neighborhoods, downtowns, communities, and large landscapes. We choose these projects very carefully based on their importance to the communities in which they reside, but importantly about the diverse stories that they tell about our American past and the way that we could work towards making a difference and protecting them to ensure that they thrive into the future. With 27 historic sites of our own and decades of experience helping other organizations protect and reimagine their historic sites, we want to bring our expertise and our resources to help San Francisco Heritage identify the stories and the programming that will ensure this house reflects its history at the epicenter of this countercultural movement. Last fall, through the generosity of American Express, we were able to secure a gift of $150,000 to help get this project underway with some improvements on the exterior and soon a new roof, which is very much And now, working with Mike and Peter, we hope that you will help us tell us your story and share how this important time in American history changed you or your family, so we can make this corner a countercultural destination devoted to the interpretation and study of the seminal 60s movement. Because as we all know, there's no better place to tell a story of history than in that place where history happened. So thank you, and thanks again to our friends and partners who are joining us on this journey. And now I want to turn things over to one of those new friends and partners, Peter McQuaid of the Haight Street Art Center. Peter and everyone at the center do an amazing job to provide workspace, which is hard to do in this economy, and resources for local artists and to foster artistic creativity in the schools and in the community. Peter embodies some of the best values of the Haight: its community spirit, its idealism, and its support of creative expression.
I first want to mention that with me today is Jeff Idelson, who's one of our board members from Cooperstown, New York, and came all the way across the country to be here for this. And I thank you for that, Jeff. And on behalf of Jeff and myself and all of the board at the Haight Street Art Center, we simply just want to say thank you to the Heritage and the Trust people for allowing us to be part of this. This is a huge opportunity in so many ways. You couldn't get into them all now. Our art center was opened 2 years ago. It's been going on for longer than that. It's devoted to the art movement, the artists and the artwork that was created here now 55 years ago. And as we prepared to open in our initial show, we devoted a lot of time to the posters there. Posters are our big focus, and posters are really artifacts if you think about it. They are the documentation of what happened here, all the things Barbara is talking about. We have a record of them through the posters that were left behind, which led us to believe that there was really something missing, that beyond the artwork, there was a chance to get into the reasons for the counterculture and who stood up for the right causes and who made it all happen here. We couldn't be happier for this. We committed 2 years ago to find a place or a way to get into this, what we're going to do now, so it's almost as though this was fated. Thank you so much. I also want to say that what's exciting to me personally is that this is an opportunity to not only celebrate the past, but we can go into the future with this project. That it should be something that appeals to both young people, seniors. It should appeal to people that just moved to San Francisco, families that have been here for generations. It should appeal to the merchants in this neighborhood. We could be a central connector of all these different facets of this community, and something that we very much look forward to. And so now, I want to introduce a woman who was instrumental in bringing the Art Center into San Francisco, our supervisor, Vallie Brown.
I just want to thank everyone for being here today, and I definitely want to thank the SF Heritage for making this happen in the National Trust. You know, I was a little bit too young to be in this the culture, but if I was that age, I would have been here. I mean, that's just me. Because most people see me walking around with no shoes on all the time anyway, so they said you would totally fit in, and I just live up the street. But you know, when I think about Haight-Ashbury and I think about the values, I mean, I grew up in Utah. I'm half Native American. My father died when I was a year old, and we moved a lot. We had housing instability. I was on and off reservations, and wandered around Utah most of the time, usually moving before we got evicted. And when my mother died when I was 14, because we didn't have health care. And so when I think about Haight-Ashbury and the movement, it's not just about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It is about the policies and the things that started here, the movement. To think that there was a Haight-Ashbury free clinic. And I have a funny story. So I moved here in the 80s when I was in my early 20s after college. I lived in warehouses in the South of Market. And I was like running across in my bare feet the wood floor, and I got this huge sliver in my foot like this. Yeah, and it was, I couldn't get it out. So someone said, go to Haight Street Free Clinic, they'll get it out. So I went in there, and Flash Gordon, remember him? The doctor, and I couldn't believe his name was Flash Gordon. And he said, hey, you're gonna have to wait a bit because you're low priority, you got a sliver, I get it, or whatever. So that's what they said. But what was really funny is that while I'm waiting, I had people that worked there came up to me. This one woman said, hey, I am, I'm a resident here. Can I give you a pap smear? I'm practicing. It doesn't happen. And I was like, sure. And so, we did the whole thing. She gave me, because I had never had one, if you can believe it, never had one. So then Flash Gordon came in, he's looking at my chart, and he sees pap smear, all this stuff, breast exam, and he goes, what are you here for? I thought you were here for a sliver. I said, no, but I wanted to practice. So that is a story. Yeah. That was a Haight-Ashbury free clinic. I love them. I'll never forget that because I had gone there so many times for antibiotics if I needed something. I had pneumonia, things like that. And then the collective living. People lived here collectively. They moved in together. They lived collectively. And that's something that I did with my friends. We lived collectively. I wouldn't be here today if that wasn't how we lived. I would be priced out. And then also just feeding the hungry. Remember, the diggers would feed the hungry and vulnerable. And these policies, whether you call them progressive, independent, whatever you want to call them, they shaped San Francisco and our policies. And today, I'm fighting for healthcare, for free healthcare for people. I'm fighting to make sure we have women's rights. I'm fighting for shelter, making sure that we have a place for people to go, and fighting for people that never go hungry, whether you're a teenager or a senior. So these are things that came out of Haight-Ashbury. And no matter what anybody says about the good or the bad, these policies shape San Francisco, and San Francisco shapes the nation. And I'm just very proud to be the supervisor here. And I've been here a couple of events years ago when I was at legislative aid, political events, and I always said, Norm, never mince words. If you remember, he always pretty much gave it to you straight. And I really want to thank the Larson family for letting us have this amazing place. I mean, it's dear to my heart. So thank you everyone for coming, and let's move forward.